Hello and welcome to another edition of Clarkenomics. In this video, we're going to learn about economic transitions, meaning a country that has one type of economy decides to transition to having a different type of economy. So the first question you might be asking right out of the gate here is, why would a country want to do this? Well, now that you've studied command economies and market economies in a different video, you know that each of them does have, advantages, but each of them also has disadvantages as well. And that really in the real world, no true market or command economies exist. It's a mixed economy. It's got some command elements and some market elements. So, when we say economic transitions here, we're talking about moving along that spectrum, right? And of course, you could go either way. You could go from a more market-based economy to a more command-based economy, but we're really going to focus on the other direction, going from a command-based economy to a more market-based economy, because that's what we've really seen more of over the past, 30, 40 years. So, why make this transition? Well, first, outside of economics, political things happen, right? So the first reason in many of the countries that have done this over the past half century is some political revolution, some overthrow of the government. And a good example would be the Soviet Union, which I've referenced in a previous video. The Soviet Union existed from 1922 until 1991. In 1991, the Soviet Union more or less disintegrated into a bunch of smaller independent countries such as Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, places like that. So it was politics that made the change rather than economics. However, they are intertwined. The reason why people rose up against the Soviet government was because one of the reasons was because the economy was so bad. Because, economics isn't just a study of numbers and graphs, it's studying how people make choices and the effects of policy on people's lives. And so that was the reason why that happened in the Soviet Union. Now, because it was a political revolution, everything happened pretty quickly. So they overthrew the government, they formed new governments very quickly. We're talking within a year or two here. And so with a new government comes a new economy. But you're not just switching economies, you're also switching leaders. You're kind of booting out all the people who used to be in charge of your country and putting new people in power, oftentimes democratically, which can be messy. So the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991, and from there, all of the new countries that came out of it had to change their command economies to more market-based economies. So some future examples of this, possibly, could include countries like Cuba. Cuba right now has a command-leading economy, but they've been moving in a more free market direction. North Korea and Venezuela remain relatively stuck in command mode, but in both of those countries, people don't necessarily like their governments very much. And so if the government were to ever change or the governments were to relax their control over their people, you might see a transition towards a more market-based system. But let's talk about the countries that don't have a political revolution happen. Countries where it's all about survival. You know, Command economies have a lot of disadvantages. They often fail, and the leaders of a country don't necessarily want to be violently overthrown. So what they will sometimes try to do is they'll try to adapt the economy, incorporate just a few elements of a market economy to make people's lives better so that hopefully they don't rise up and revolt. So in these types of countries, the government's just trying to stay afloat. They're making these changes out of necessity, out of survival. So some examples of countries in this situation would be more like China or Vietnam. And we'll talk more about China in a later slide here, but Vietnam is a good example of a country that was very communist through the 1970s through the 1980s. The United States fought a war in Vietnam to try to stop them from being communist, and that didn't even work. In the 1990s, they actually started transitioning to a more market-based system on their own because the people of Vietnam started to see that the system that they had was not working. And so this is what you'd like to see happen in countries rather than any kind of, violent revolution. So the problem with there are many problems with a fast transition. Going back to the Soviet Union, this happened all very suddenly, not just a new economy, but a new government too. So these quick transitions caused a lot of chaos. One, the government in the command economy used to provide a lot of things, healthcare, education, all of these things for the people, regardless of how much money they had or their willingness to pay. We called it a safety net. Well, now that's gone. The government used to provide everything to you, and now they don't. So what does that mean for you? It means you have to go out and make stuff happen for yourself. Housing, food, work, all that used to be guaranteed to you to some degree. And so homelessness is on the rise. Alcoholism is on the rise. The government is not there necessarily to take care of your wants and needs like it used to be. And then your incentives have completely changed too. Whereas before you were guaranteed a job, even if you just, were mediocre at it, now productivity matters. You're only going to get paid if you're a productive worker. And if you're not pulling your weight, they're going to fire you and you're going to have to go find another job. Now, if you're a young person living in the Soviet Union at this time, young people are very adaptable, very flexible. But try to think of the 50-year-old person living in the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. They've never had to, go interview for a job in a serious way. They were just assigned to a job. Productivity never mattered to them. Their only incentive was just working hard enough to get by. But the system has changed. The rules have all changed, and everything they've kind of learned and done over the past 50 years is now different. So that's tough. And then from a legal standpoint, the laws have to change too. In a command economy, there's no private property. The government owns everything. But when you change to a market-based economy, now we're going to introduce private property. And you can't just say, oh, okay, this is mine now. There have to be laws in place to make sure that people can claim property rightfully and that that property is protected from others. And so taking things out of the government's hands and putting them into households' hands and firms' hands was a major challenge. This is called privatization. Privatization is when you take something that used to belong to the government and you make it belong to the private sector, in other words, households and firms. So if you think back to like firms in the Soviet Union, they weren't really firms, they were all owned by the government. Now you have to take those electrical plants, take those car companies, and put them in the hands of the people. That's really tricky to do. Some countries try to use these little things called vouchers, almost like offering shares of stock, if you know how the stock market works, where everybody owns a little piece of a company. But regardless, making this change is pretty tough. And in the meantime, the firms, these new kind of independent firms, can't create as much stuff. And when there's not as much stuff, prices go up because everything gets rarer. And from that, we get inflation. And inflation will be a major topic down the road. But for now, all you need to know about inflation is that prices are going up. The value of money is decreasing. You need more money to get the same stuff. And so people's incomes are getting squeezed here. And so all of these things happened in the Soviet Union, right? The safety net went away. Incentives all changed. They had to establish a whole system of property laws. And they went through some pretty bad inflation in some countries where prices rose by thousands of percents per year. So some tough times. You might think, wow, okay, great, they're going to have a market economy. It's all smooth sailing. But to get from a command-based system to a market-based system can be pretty darn painful. And that's what these people lived through. So a different approach is a more slow and steady approach, like we talked about. Some countries don't just yank the rug out. They make some changes over a longer period of time. So a great example of this would be China. China first became communist under a leader named Mao Zedong in 1949. He was a dictator of China. When this communist revolution happened, or concluded rather, the government seized control of the factors of production, like we know they do. It's all socialized. The government owns everything. They also shut off trade with non-communist countries. So like in the 50s and the 60s, China did not trade with countries like the United States. And in attempting to industrialize the country and modernize the country, kind of like the Soviets had done in the 1920s and the 1930s, this led to, unfortunately, widespread famine and literally millions of people dead under Mao. So China in the 50s and especially the 60s is pretty notorious for the death toll. This changed somewhat suddenly in 1978. In 1978, after Mao died in 1976, a new leader took power in China. His name was Deng Xiaoping, and what he's most famous for is beginning a change in policy. He realized that the Maoist way of doing things that resulted in millions of deaths and famine did not work for the Chinese people, which is one of the most populous, or the most populous country on earth. So he began a new program called the Reform and Opening Up. That's what the Chinese would call it, written in English. So it's a gradual transition. And the key word there is gradual, meaning not sudden, not all at once, but just a little bit at a time. One of Deng's most famous quotes is this one: "We cross the river by feeling for stones. You can't just jump across the river, you'll drown. You need to take it one careful step at a time. Feel for a stone to step on to get your footing before you move forward. Don't try to move forward too quickly. And so, what the reform and opening up meant for the average Chinese person was that households had a little bit more freedom returned to them. They could buy things with their own money more. They could produce things that they wanted to. There was a little bit more room for entrepreneurs to start new businesses. Now, again, it's not that they went all the way and abolished government control of stuff. In China, even today, there's a lot of production owned by the government, and there's a lot of production owned by entrepreneurs and private firms. So it's a blend. China decided to move from the command side of the spectrum towards more of the market side of the spectrum. And the most notable change was opening up international trade with the West. When we say the West, we mean like Europe and North America. So as you know, China trades very much with the United States. They're our biggest trading partner, or second biggest. They're up there with Canada. But the point is, this is a result of what Deng Xiaoping did in China, opening up China to the world, letting people and firms control their destiny more. And so China, unlike, the Soviet Union, saw a lot more success and a lot less upheaval. It just took a little bit of a longer time. We're talking from 1978 until the present. That's a period of, about 40 years that we're talking about here for China to make these changes to the, successful economy that they are now. Of course, again, it's not all smooth sailing. Things that the Chinese government used to provide to its people, they don't anymore. In the rush to make money, a lot of people in China have been hurt or have been killed. It's one of the most polluted countries in the world. So it's not to say that they're without problems, but it is to say that the standard of living for millions of Chinese people has risen extraordinarily over the past 40 years. Look no further than the height of the average Chinese person. Chinese people used to be shorter than, let's say, Americans, like physically shorter, because their nutrition wasn't matching that of people living in the United States because of the decisions their government was making, the what, the how, and the for whom. As China became more advanced and more free and more open and more market based, people got better nutrition. And as that happened, Chinese babies got healthier and grew faster. And now that gap in height and that gap in economic prosperity is closing between Chinese people and the rest of the world. So these decisions that governments make have real impacts on the people that live in these countries. Thank you for watching.